speaking, I'll be continuing the goal that we set for ourselves yesterday, which is to perform efficient online learning and fast online learning in a statistical, both in a statistical and computational sense. But today we'll deal with much more complicated environment than the simple IIT stochastic rewards case that we saw yesterday, and that will be in the framework of Markovian environments, right? So typical Markov decision process abstraction that is used so widely in reinforcement learning. We'll try and see how we can deal with uncertainty in a Markovian or an MDP type environment. Okay, so we'll continue the theme from yesterday, and we'll try and extend this idea of posterior sampling or Bayesian inspired Thompson sampling to try and see if it can be made to work to learn MDPs as well. Okay, so please interrupt me whenever you think you are not getting something. It's very likely I might have sort of missed a few concepts here and there, so I'll be happy to explain it to you. Right, so as we said yesterday, we covered some aspects of online learning in bandit problems, where basically there's no concept of a state evolution, right? So the system that you're dealing with, the environment that you're acting in, really has no state. It just has one state, and the only uncertainty lies in what rewards you want to explore and exploit over. Okay, so here today we'll look at extending this to Markovian environments, where there's also a concept of state, and this changes the game somewhat fundamentally, in the sense that your state evolution is controlled by what actions you play, and simultaneously the rewards or feedback that you receive is also controlled by what you do, right? What the decision maker does. So in some sense you have to be aware of not straying into states that you know will be disadvantageous for you, in the sense that you might get stuck in some portions of the state space and so on, right? So you have to be aware of some aspects of planning given a model of state evolution, in order that you can control and hence obtain good rewards. Okay, and all this has to be done under uncertainty. Okay, so I'll set up the problem a little more formally as we go along. Right, so you've seen sort of various aspects of reinforcement learning in the Markov decision process framework. So this is just one more aspect, which is basically regret minimization. This relates exactly to what Chaba presented right towards the end of his series of lectures, where if you recall, the concept of optimization in the face of uncertainty was extended to Markov decision processes, where you keep an estimate of all observed transition probabilities, all observed rewards, and then you try and somehow build an optimistic MDP in that space of estimated MDPs, and then try and sort of optimize, exploit in that setting. Okay, so we're going to talk about similar concepts today, except that we're going to use this rather very cheeky procedure of Thompson sampling, which says, look, don't just care about uncertainty, optimism and stuff like that. Just randomly sample from a belief and things will be fine. Okay. So what's a Markov decision process, right? Just to recap. So we'll deal throughout with finite state, finite action Markov decision processes. Although most of the algorithm that we will see, which is basically the Thompson sampling framework, can be easily extended to work with potentially infinite state spaces and so on. Okay, but that's still very much ongoing work. So basically we'll deal with finite state, finite action Markov decision processes. The state space is known, the action space is known. There are transition probabilities that the environment adheres to, and there's a reward function as well, right? So the assumption is that there is an unknown Markov decision process environment that the agent is put inside and must learn to adapt to. Okay, so at the behind the scenes are these transition probabilities corresponding to the environment, and also a notion of reward, which basically maps state, action and next state into a reward, okay, scalar reward. Right. So of course, as we saw, the special case is just a simple multi-arm bandit, which nevertheless is also non-trivial in the sense of uncertainty being present in the reward space, in the space of reward functions. And so essentially it becomes an exercise in estimating and dealing with uncertainty in reward functions. So here there's an additional dimension of uncertainty, which is basically not knowing the transition probabilities as well. And that in some sense is fairly non-trivial to deal with. Okay? Because if there's uncertainty or transition probabilities, it really affects your planning in the state space. So you might be misled into going into parts of the state space from where you do not know that you can't get back easily and so on, right? So you have to be much more aware of how your motion is being governed by constant properties, right? Right, so just to put down a concrete example, so this is how typically people visualize Markov decision processes. So the green islands here are basically the states. So there is a 3-state MDP with 2 actions, right? So the set of actions is of size 2 and the set of states is of size 3. The green islands are states and the red islands are actions, right? So for instance, if you are at state S2 and you basically decide to choose one of action A0 and A1, you'll go with different transition probabilities, right? So if you choose action A0, then basically you'll end up at this island, and from here you'll probabilistically go to either state S0 or come back to S2 and so on. Okay, so this is basically your state space, and you can visualize this in a graphical manner. Okay. Right. So again, so the foundational assumption here is that we of course don't know the environment a priori. Otherwise, the agent can easily get hold of a planning algorithm like value iteration, dynamic programming, policy iteration, and so on. One of these many methods, and then easily compute what is the best way to act in the MDP. Right? So if you knew the parameter, so by an MDP parameter, basically, I'll come to it a few moments from now. But the parameter is really, you can think of in the canonical case as the description of all the transition probabilities and all the reward functions. Okay, so that is essentially one way of specifying the MDP, right? So suppose for all practical purposes here, you can think of the parameter as really being the MDP, right? So suppose the real MDP is unknown to the decision maker a priori, but nevertheless the goal is to try and learn the optimal policy by simultaneously exploring and collecting rewards. Okay, and by learn optimal policy, we mean it in the specific sense that the agent must take an action given a certain state. So the agent gets feedback about the current state. Okay, so wherever he or she is in the environment, and the agent must take an action to maximize the total reward. Okay, so it's a simple goal. You must optimize the total reward in a window of, let's say, capital T time steps. However, with complete uncertainty about the MDP environment as such at the beginning. Okay, so and note that this is fairly sensitive to every reward that you collect inside the time window. Right, so you can't. Approaches like waiting for some time and then just exploring randomly and estimating your state transitions or rewards, and then building a queue function and then trying to optimize with respect to that, planning with respect to that queue function and then playing for some more time may not be really optimal, because you might be implicitly wasting some time in the estimation, right? So you need to be careful about how long you are estimating whatever quantities you want of interest versus how often you are really trying and planning and exploiting. Okay, so this is again the familiar exploration versus exploitation trade-off, but in a much more complicated state-based environment. Is that clear? Essentially, the objective is just to maximize the reward. Or equivalently, we can also go take the route of defining regret here. So regret here is really philosophically the difference between what the agent in question does versus what an agent with complete a priori knowledge of the environment would do. Okay, so in this case, if the MDP was completely known to the agent a priori, then the agent could, as I said, simply plan out the entire future and play out some optimal policy for the MDP in question, and then get some optimal reward here, right? So we represent by AT star the optimal action to take at time t, depending on the state that the agent finds itself at time t, versus the not the optimal reward, but the total reward that the agent collects starting from uncertainty in the environment. Okay, and so actually I wrote it down as just the sum of two random terms, but really we think of regret in the expected sense, right? So in the expected sense, if we take expectation of this quantity throughout, the left hand term will just become actually if you take it, so the left hand term will essentially reduce to t times the average, the optimal average reward that the agent can earn per time step versus the expected value of the total reward, right? So this is the expectation as usual. Okay. And the expectation can be over both the random transitions of the environment, the random rewards that the agent receives, as well as any internal randomness that the agent uses, right? So you can use a randomized algorithm to try and optimize. Is that clear? Yes.
Just one quick thing so that the guys don't get confused. The T itself is random, right? The capital T itself is random.
Capital T actually need not be random. Capital T is fixed.
So it not be, right? If I am following the optimal policy, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I would have the same distribution over T as if I am following an arbitrary policy. Or are you assuming that the episodes run only for T steps?
Yeah, the episodes essentially run for T steps. So actually, you start at time equal to 0 or time equal to 1.
Yeah.
And so imagine T as being large. Right? So T is a large time horizon. Let's say sort of the average return time under whatever policies you choose to play is fairly small compared to T. Right? So T scales to be large enough, and hence you basically try and implement. So we'll be interested as T goes to infinity, essentially. Right? So in fact, it helps to probably normalize this entire thing by T. Okay. So we'll be interested in really approaching the optimal average reward performance. Right? Is that clear? Right, so the trade-off here is again, should you decide as an agent to given your current state of knowledge, to explore the state space, to explore the space of actions or reward functions, or rather in some sense exploit existing knowledge to just plan given what you have and hope that you will get good returns, right? So we saw one way to do this. This was the UCRL2 algorithm which Chaba alluded to in the end. So the broad principle here is the same principle that underlies the UCP algorithm for bandits, which is basically that you've seen a certain sample path or a trajectory up to the time at which you have to make a decision. So using all the data that you have gathered till now, just build estimates for all the transition probabilities, for all the reward functions, and moreover build confidence intervals for each of them. And within this sort of collection of possible confidence intervals and rewards, try and somehow compute an optimistic MDP. Okay, so the notion of an optimistic MDP has to be defined carefully, but Jackson and Ortner and Auer in 2007 with their UCRL algorithm showed that you can indeed compute a notion of what is an optimistic policy in this space. Okay? An optimistic MDP and hence an optimistic policy for that. And with a carefully designed schedule of changing the policy or computing this optimal policy with increasing or doubling episodes, you can show that an algorithm like that works really well. Right? So it's really the extension of the UCB or upper confidence bound algorithm to the MDP setting. Okay. Right. So the key idea is basically to maintain both point estimates as well as high confidence sets in probability for each estimated transition probability and reward. Okay, for every state action pair, and this is not too hard to maintain. Okay. Right. So this brings me to the main point of the model that we want to consider in this talk. Which is that look, this is all nice and good. It's a nice general way to try and solve an MDP under uncertainty, but it is somewhat wasteful or inefficient if you know that there is much more structure in the MDP. Okay, so for instance, if you know that certain state transitions cannot occur a priori, right? Or for instance, the rewards of certain at certain neighboring states are fairly close by or almost equal, right? So if you know much more structure or a priori side information about these things, you can essentially dispense with learning large portions of the state action space, okay? The space of transition rewards, transition probabilities and rewards, okay? And that is going to be the central motivation of studying what are called parameterized MDPs, okay? So I'll illustrate this with a concrete example. Right, so let's consider an example, one sort of rather extreme example of a parameterized MDP, which basically represents a physical queuing system. Right, so think of this as the state space for a queue. Okay, so I don't know how many of you are. So this is motivated mainly from the communications or control literature, but you have let's say you're working with a single queue and you have to control the queue. Right, by control the queue, I mean the actions that you can take are going to be basically service the queue, right? By service the queue, I mean servicing a packet from the queue. Okay? So you can control these queues, the single queue with by controlling the service to the queue, and there are random arrivals that come into the queue and then come and sit in the queue. Okay? So I'll describe this in more detail, right? So the state space really is here is so it's a single queue, and let's assume that it has a maximum capacity of capital N customers, okay, or packets. So really the state space of the Markov decision process here is basically how many customers are there in the queue. Right? So it can be from 0, 1, 2 all the way up to N. Okay? So it's an N+1 state Markov chain. Okay, it's a discrete time queue, which just means that all events happen in time slots, you can assume, right? So we'll assume that, and this is really key to this model of the parameterized MDP, this example. We'll really assume that no matter where you are in the state space, right, at every given time, a customer enters the queue with probability lambda. Okay, you can either have only one customer enter or no customers enter, right? So let's confine ourselves to a simple world where at each instant only one packet can come into the queue, right? So think of some process that is putting packets in the queue, right? There's some source of data that is feeding the queue, right? So the input to the queue is essentially a random arrivals process, which essentially is an independent and identically distributed Bernoulli lambda arrival. Okay? So lambda is a number between 0 and 1, and at each time a coin is tossed, and if it lands heads, a customer is deposited into the queue. Okay? So this is something that is not under our control. Okay? This is something that is a property of nature, this is a property of the environment. Okay? We have two actions in this case. So the MDP here has two actions. I have to specify the state space, which I did. I have to specify the action space. So there are two actions called fast and slow, which basically correspond to serving this queue with a fast rate or a slow rate, right? So what this means is, if I choose at any given instant of time, choose the fast action, then basically I can serve this queue, I can remove one packet from the queue with probability mu1. Okay? So if I go and say let me serve the queue at a fast rate, so this corresponds to sort of taking one packet from the queue and then pushing it to a fast server. Right? Let's say you have two servers, one fast and one slow, right? And you can make only one routing decision at each time instant, right? So let's say so fast service gets you a probability of flushing out one packet from the queue with probability mu1, which is again a number between 0 and 1. And slow service basically gets you probability of service, which is mu2. And clearly mu1 will be greater than mu2, okay, because it has to be fast and slow, right? The key thing is we'll assume that these things are known, right? So there's no uncertainty in mu1 and mu2. You know mu1 and mu2. There is complete uncertainty about lambda. Okay. So if you think about this a little bit, right, so service rates are known again, uncertainty in lambda only. Everything else is known about the system, about the MDP, right? So if you think about the MDP, if you write the state transition diagram for the MDP, there are again these n+1 states. So I'll denote the state transitions corresponding to fast service by red arrows and slow service by blue arrows. Okay, so if you think of being at a certain state, so basically let's say you're at state 1, that means there is one customer in the queue, right? If you decide to serve the queue with a fast service rate, then what will happen, right? So there are two things that could happen. There are three things that could happen, right? Basically, you could either stay in the same state because outcomes are probabilistic, right? You could either stay in the same state, you could either eventually take one customer out of the queue, or you could basically not be able to take a customer out of the queue and there's one more extra customer that comes in. Okay, so from state 1 you can either go to state 0 or 2. Okay, so the same thing will hold at every state pretty much, except the ends which are a little special. But there are essentially transitions either to the left or right, or you stay at the same place, right? And if you just think about a transition going from 1 to 0, this happens exactly with probability 1 minus lambda times mu1, because this is the probability that no arrival occurs and also that you serve a customer. So essentially your net decrease is -1, right? And then likewise, so you can build the entire state transition diagram, and the important thing to note is that all these state transitions, the probabilities of these state transitions will essentially be functions of lambda, mu1 and mu2, right? Clearly, because they are the only quantities that determine how the transitions occur, right? And again, since we have assumed that mu1 and mu2 are completely known, the only uncertainty in this entire MDP is basically lambda. That would mean that if you knew what was lambda, you would essentially know all the transition probabilities perfectly, and hence you would know the MDP perfectly, right? So what I'm trying to just allude to is the fact that the single parameter here, which is lambda, essentially controls the entire spectrum of MDPs that can occur in within this framework. Right? So the single dimensional uncertainty in lambda, so the state space could be very large, right? So n could be really large, but irrespective of that, it's not as if there is uncertainty in every transition probability separately, right? There's really uncertainty only in one single dimension, which is lambda. And if someone told you that lambda, or at least gave you some bounds on that, then you would have a very, very good description of a very good handle on what the MDP is, right? So this is an extreme example of a parameterized MDP. The number of states could be really large, number of actions could be really large, but as long as your there's a sort of small or lower dimensional parameter, the uncertainty over which controls the uncertainty of the MDP, you're in a nice sort of parameterized MDP setting, right? This can extend to even uncountably many states and actions and so on, right? The key thing is you really are dealing with much more structured environments where the uncertainty can really be parametric. Okay, is that clear? Right, it's just a motivating example, right? So here in this case, it would be rather inefficient to sort of ignore this structure and say, look, I'm just trying to learn all the transition probabilities and rewards separately, right? Or in this case, all the transition probabilities separately. And that just corresponds to saying, look, I will just ignore the fact that if I know something about the state transitions in state 1, I essentially know a lot about state transitions in all the other states, right? And this is a fairly reasonable, this is a fairly practical example that occurs. So queuing systems often are described by a few parameters like arrival rates, service rates, and so on, right? So you typically model these arrival processes and service processes using a few parametric probability distributions, and that essentially influences the entire structure of the MDP that one builds. Okay. Right, so essentially trying to use an approach where you decouple the uncertainty across all state action pairs and try and learn, incrementally whenever you visit a state action pair, you update the estimate for that and so on. You do this optimistic planning type approach is potentially wasteful in terms of sample, because you're not really sort of reusing experience gained in certain parts of the state action space to other parts of the state action space. Okay, as you could very much do if you had some more structure. Okay. So again, here is where sort of very general recipe comes to mind immediately, which is basically Thompson sampling, right? So this posterior based sampling, right? So essentially think of, so the ellipse here, so this whole set represents, think of this as the uncertainty space, or really the space of parameters, right? So each parameter here corresponds essentially to an entire instance of an MDP, right? A parameterized MDP. So each point here, for instance, could represent an entire queuing system MDP or so on, okay? And as you vary parameters here, you basically get different types of environments, which is essentially different types of transition probability functions and different types of rewards, okay? And within this, we assume that we have the unknown environment, which is some particular point in this space, right? So this is the theta star point, okay? The recipe just tells you go and put, let's say start with an arbitrary belief distribution over the state space, over this parameter space, sorry. Just sample a point randomly, right? So this is the sampling, the random sampling is essentially tied to the idea of exploration. Okay? So just randomly sample a point, a parameter in this parameter space that essentially corresponds to sampling an entire instance of an MDP, right? This is equivalent to sampling an entire MDP, right? So use this parametric MDP, right? And now you have a parametric MDP that you have sampled. Go ahead and plan for it, right? Assume that that is really the true MDP. And find the optimal plan for it, right? In whatever sense of optimality that you want to maximize. So it could be average reward, it could be episodic reward, it could be the discounted reward criterion and so on, right? So assume that you have an oracle or a black box that given a parameter or equivalently an MDP gives you a sort of a best plan for that, right? So in the bandit case, it's really playing the best action, but in the MDP case, I should really say best policy, right? So there exists a best notion of an optimal policy given an MDP. So the black box or oracle is just going to return you that policy, right, or a description of that, which you can actually go ahead and implement. Okay. Right, and then so I haven't told you exactly how you want to implement that policy, but I'll come to it later. So whatever optimal policy that is being returned for the sampled MDP, just go ahead and play it. Okay. for maybe one time slot or some number of time slots. And once you do that, you'll again have a sequence of fresh observations from the real environment that you're trying to play in. Using that, you can easily update your prior belief to a posterior belief, right? So the update of the prior belief to the posterior belief is really a reweighting of all your models or parameters in the parameter space, right? So essentially, corresponding to each point in this parameter space, you go and sort of reweight it by the probability, by the likelihood that what you actually observed while playing the policy was actually generated due to a particular candidate point in the space, right? And this reweight all these prior probabilities by the corresponding likelihood that you saw, okay, of the output that you saw. So this is a simple base theorem of it. Yeah.
Has to be a likelihood model, right? I mean,
there has to be a likelihood model. So
is it easy to come up with a likelihood model?
So the likelihood model in this case is exactly going to be the map from a parameter to the transition probabilities. So the map given a
seems like, right?
Also rewards and also transition probabilities, because what you observe in a trajectory of a Markov decision process is both states and rewards, right? So you observe state transitions. So information that you collect across a trajectory is both state transitions and rewards, right? You in some sense cannot afford to throw away information about state transition, because every state transition, adjacent state transition pair is basically helping you. So there is a likelihood associated given a parameter for each state transition, right? So essentially it will be the product of all state transitions that you saw in the trajectory together with the product of, as you said, all reward likelihoods, right? So the transition probability matrix probability of ST plus 1 given ST and AT as a function of theta is basically the likelihood of the probability transition. So there are two types of likelihoods involved. Thanks for the question.
So in this where you are using the structure basically, so it is just to reduce the number of parameters, or means the same setting should apply to a general MDP, and why do you feel that does it not work in a general setting? Thompson sampling, it works well when you have a small number of parameters.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So of course it will work even in a general setting. So I'm just saying, so I haven't told you what should be the structure of a parameterization. So I'm just saying, whenever you have any possible parameterization, you can get hold of it and you can build this thing, right? So the most general or canonical or uninformative parameterization is really the complete parameterization. It's called the canonical parameterization, right? Which essentially is the one that motivates UCRL and other algorithms. Basically, in that parameterization, you say that I'll treat a parameter as essentially the full set of parameters. So there is a parameter corresponding to every state action pair in terms of reward as well as transition probability, right? So it's essentially the full set of parameters. And if there is no structure among this full set of parameters, it's the least informative setting, where you have to go and actually learn all these transition probabilities individually and in isolation. Okay? So of course it will still work in that setting. But the real power or advantage of this kind of approach is, as you said, when the parameter space is really small. All the dimensionality of the, you can think of them as dimensionality of the free parameters is really small, right? So in the queuing system example, the dimensionality of the free parameters was really one dimensional, right? So it was just a scalar line, right? Whereas if you think of the canonical parameterization of an MDP with n states and 2 actions as in that setting, you will have a number of parameters as some polynomial in n, right? So you'll have to learn those many parameters individually, right? So really so essentially the gains come from settings where you can actually identify much smaller dimensionality of essential parameters, right, of the parameterization. Right, so maybe just to put this down clearly. So you have a prior, right? So at the start of each sort of instant of time that you're doing this Thompson sampling process, let's say you have a prior distribution. Over your parameter space, okay? Right, so I call the whole parameter space as this capital theta, okay? So this is called capital theta. Okay, so let me denote it by pi, okay? So pi is a probability distribution over the space theta, okay? essentially over the space of all parameters, or equivalently even over the space of all possible MDPs that are under consideration, right? So this update is really, so what you do is sample this is a small case theta, right? So according to pi, and then so this theta will basically give rise to a policy C, right? So I'll denote policies as C. So corresponding to the MDP that was generated by parameter theta, let's say there's some planner or some oracle that returns an output C saying, look, go ahead and play this policy C. It's the optimal thing to do when the environment really was theta. Okay, and so you run this policy T for a certain amount of time, for instance, let's say for the next tau time steps, right? Right, so what you will get when you run this policy, follow this policy for the next tau time steps is, okay, so let's say you're at time t in the beginning of all this, right? Right, so you essentially get observations st plus 1, okay, so let's say you played an action at, right? So the sequence, the trajectory that you will get after this is at st plus 1 RT plus 1, right? So this is the action, then the next state and the corresponding reward. Then again the action, and so on. Okay? So this is essentially a trajectory that you will get up to, let's say, A t plus tau, S t plus tau plus 1, and R t plus tau plus 1. Agreed? So this is essentially the segment of the trajectory that you will see after you follow this procedure. And using this, you can essentially update the prior to the posterior in this very simple way. So this base rule essentially is just reweighting. So it just says, let's say you had a prior distribution pi t. You essentially update the distribution at time t plus tau of each theta as proportional to the prior, right, times the probability that you would see this entire trajectory. Okay. Say this entire trajectory here under if the real system was actually theta. Okay. Okay. So if the real MDP was actually theta, then what is the likelihood that you would actually see the sequence of observations? Okay. When you played this, of course, when you fix the policy C. And if you do this reweighting across the entire state space and normalize so that the new distribution is equal to 1, that is essentially an application of base rule. Okay. Is that clear? Right. So essentially, what you need at the most basic level is a likelihood description of likelihood that takes you from parameters to actual likelihoods in the MDP. That is state transition probabilities and the likelihood of observing rewards, which is essentially the reward distribution. So this kind of scheme is of course very natural to conceive. It's motivated really from Bayesian approach. Already although there is really nothing Bayesian about this process as such. So we have not really assumed that nature is Bayesian and that the actual uncertain MDP that we are working in actually comes from an unknown distribution that nature draws and gives to us. Right? So there is nothing of that sort going on. We are actually trying to learn in an unknown fixed environment, and we're just starting out by imposing a sort of fake or a fictitious prior distribution, and then just trying to pretend that the world is Bayesian and trying to update it using Bayes rule. Okay. So the natural question is really, will this work at all? Does it give the right amount of exploration or exploitation in this MDP setting? And as we would intuitively expect, when you do this for a long amount of time steps or episodes, will you really get the entire probability of the posterior distribution trying to sort of move towards the actual true parameter theta star, okay? Or will it even concentrate at the right rates, and correspondingly can you minimize your regret and at what rates? Okay? So these are the natural questions that you can ask in an analytical sense. And recently, it was indeed shown that this stuff works. Okay, so the recent work by the team at Stanford, led by Ben Van Roy and the students, that essentially analyzed this problem in actually the pure Bayesian setting, right? So by pure Bayesian setting, what I mean is they consider an episodic setting where there are several episodes of a fixed duration, right? As Ravi was hinting, and at the beginning of each episode, there is actually a real prior distribution from which nature picks an MDP and gives it to you, right? It's an unknown MDP, but you know that it's been picked from that distribution, and the algorithm, this Thompson sampling algorithm, starts using the same prior distribution, right? It has access to the same prior distribution, and at the end of the episode, the regret is measured and essentially averaged across the prior. Okay, so this is really the true Bayesian setting where nature is assumed to be probabilistic according to a prior distribution. The algorithm is of course using the real prior distribution in its computation, and the measure of performance really what is called Bayesian regret as opposed to regret, okay? Which is essentially this notion of regret averaged across the probability distribution that nature uses. Okay? So this is the completely in the spirit of the real Bayesian analysis setting. Okay? And what they showed indeed was something nice, which is that if you play this Thompson sampling algorithm for capital T time steps or equivalently some number of episodes that scales linearly with time, you can actually get regret that is sublinear in time as square root of t. Okay, so essentially regret becomes scaled in the square root of t fashion, and there are some interesting constants that come into the picture which essentially help to capture the structure of the MDP parameterization. Okay, so this result holds for general parameterized MDP, and the two constants basically called the Kolmogorov dimension of the parameterization and the Eludar dimension of the parameterization. So Kolmogorov dimension is a quantity that has been sort of well known in statistics and learning theory. But what they really introduced new in this work was this concept of Eludar dimension, right? Which so I won't have time to get on to defining these quantities and getting down into details, but they roughly correspond to certain they relate to the geometry of the parameterization. So essentially, if you look at the parameter space capital theta, these quantities have to do with how well you can cover the space in terms of small balls and so on, right? So essentially, it's some notion of metric entropy or dimension of that space. So it essentially comes back to your question. These quantities relate to the essential dimension of the parameterization, right? They have to capture the dimension. So in several cases, if the parameterization is really compact, like the queuing system that we saw, then these quantities will quickly be small, and then you'll be able to get much better rates of regret scaling compared to if you just worked in the canonical parameterization. Okay, right? So this was some work that came along in the spirit of the real Bayesian setting, but what we are really dealing with is something a little more challenging. In some sense, we are firstly not in the Bayesian, the true Bayesian setting, in the sense that we just have the information that we are working in an unknown but fixed environment, and the prior that we use is really something that is completely subjective, right? So the prior that Thompson sampling uses in a setting where you really have to try and learn in an unknown and fixed MDP is really up to the designer's choice, right? So you can design any sort of suitable prior that you are comfortable with, and just try and apply Thompson sampling, and then see, ask the question, look what happens when you do that, right? So this sort of result is that I presented is of course restricted to the Bayesian setting, in the sense that the algorithm actually gets to know the exact prior that nature chooses, and in some sense, if you think about it in a different way, the performance metric, that is Bayesian regret, is sort of really tuned to what the algorithm is using, right? So in some sense, it becomes slightly easier, whereas we really want to understand what is the true frequentist regret in an unknown but fixed MDP setting, and moreover, it turns out that we can actually show much better regret growth with time as opposed to square root of t. In fact, we can show the equivalent of the gap dependent regret in bandits, which is essentially log t over delta type regret. Okay, so in fact, we can show what I will be presenting is some results showing that we can derive actually a frequentist regret bounds for Thompson sampling in MDPs, where you can actually show that it scales as log t by delta times some constant that actually acts as analog to the Ellida dimension and captures the parameterization structure, okay, the dimension of the parameterization. This is just to give you some brief background. This is fairly recent work, I guess. Right, so just to recap the procedure that I wrote and make sure we are all comfortable with the algorithm, you essentially repeat this loop in Thompson sampling, right? So you draw an MDP instance or you draw a parameter according to your current prior belief or a posterior belief. You compute the optimal policy. So let's focus on the case where you want to try and optimize for average reward. So you've drawn a parameter, you've drawn an MDP. You essentially compute you have a black box that gives you the optimal policy for average reward. You can do it by value iteration, linear programming, or even Monte Carlo simulation, right, for long enough time. And then you play the action prescribed by the optimal policy for the current state, for the current time step, or maybe for the next few time steps, right? You might want to fix the time scale for which you stick to a certain policy and then resample again, okay? And then you just keep repeating this loop, right? In fact, consider the following particular variant, okay? So we'll call this the Thompson sampling for MDP's algorithm, right? So this particular variant that we considered was sort of more for technical purposes. So this relates to a specification of how long you should basically play the policy that you've sampled, right? From the parameter that you've sampled. So what you do is just designate, let's say, a fixed marker state, okay? So let's say the initial state could be your marker state, and basically divide the time into visits to that state, right? So divide time into cycles when you come back to that state, okay? And what we specify is basically you just sample an MDP according to Thompson sampling and just stick to it as long as you're not coming back to that state, that particular marker state, right? So essentially what we're saying is just act in cycles. Whenever you hit a particular state, just resample, okay? So of course one has to be making some technical assumptions here that policies that you will play due to Thompson sampling will lead to finite recurrence time. So there's the implicit assumption here that you're actually playing in an environment that will actually make you return to a particular start state with probability 1, okay, in finite time, in finite expected time. And provided that happens, you can always continue this prescription, right? You can basically wait for, you can implement a sampled MDP corresponding to a policy corresponding to a sampled MDP as long as you are in a cycle corresponding to visiting a particular state, right? So essentially it just says apply Thompson sampling in recurrent cycles, okay? Is that clear? Right, so sample, compute or plan and play until you hit a particular state and keep doing this. Right, and before we go on to discussing the theory or the analytical results, here is a sort of a simple simulation that actually I carried out for this queuing type MDP, right? So we had a large, I think let's say, by large I just mean let's say 100 state MDP, a queuing MDP, parameterized by a single parameter lambda, which basically denotes this arrival rates, right? And probably I forgot to mention that in the queuing MDP, I forgot to mention the rewards, right? So I defined the transition probabilities, I defined the states, I defined the actions, and rewards essentially here are correspond to both rewards and costs, right? So essentially you get a large reward, so you get a large reward whenever you serve a customer, right? So the goal here is to basically maintain a small queue, okay? So you're rewarded whenever you serve a customer, right? With let's say a fixed and known reward. And in addition, you basically have a holding cost at each point in time corresponding to how many people are there in the queue, right? So you incur a holding cost proportional to how many people are in queue. That might be a linear cost that scales as a state here. And in addition, you basically get a fair or decent reward whenever you serve a customer, right? So the onus is basically to try and serve a customer, right? Each choice of fast or slow action comes with cost as well, right? So there's a high cost for choosing a fast server, and there's a small cost for choosing a slow server, right? So you want to be able to try and balance serving customers and trying to get people out of the queue. But if you don't do that well enough, then you're basically penalized for your holding cost. Okay. So and if you come up with, there exists sort of configurations of these costs that you can set in order to get meaningful problems. Okay. This is more or less standard in modeling costs in queuing systems. Right, so we actually went ahead and just did a simple simulation. So right, so the horizontal axis is time, is really actual time, right? The vertical axis is basically regret, right, over the corresponding time interval. So the top red and blue lines essentially are runs of UCRL. Okay, so when I say UCRL, I basically mean UCRL in the canonical parameters. Right? So UCRL essentially, there is in fact no way that I know of to extend UCRL to cases where there is parameterization. Okay, so really, it's not trivial at all to design these confidence sets in the parameter space. Right? So recall that you're working actually in the parameter space. The uncertainty is all in the parameter space, and there's no principled way to sort of extend UCRL to complicated parameter spaces, because you really have to transfer the entire machinery of these confidence sets and so on into a parameters, in a much lower dimensional parameter space, right? So all that we have is essentially trying to run UCRL over, let's say, a 100-state queuing system, where it has to essentially learn state transitions and rewards individually for all the state action pairs, right? All the 2 into 100 state action pairs, okay? And and as opposed to Thompson sampling, which is in blue, which essentially I mean, you can probably argue it's sort of an unfair advantage, but really we want to see how much the difference could be if you actually allow the algorithm to know the parameterization, right? So given that the algorithm knows the parameterization, it just puts the prior, it basically starts by putting a uniform prior on the lambda set, right, which is basically 0 to 1. And this results in sort of huge gains in performance, right? So regret is essentially learning rate of Thompson sampling is much faster than what you would try and get if you try to sort of decouple learning all the parameters separately. Okay, is that clear? So just to illustrate sort of that, you could actually try and obtain dramatic gains, and really the point to note here is that given the knowledge of the structure or the parameterization, Thompson sampling is at least one way to very cleanly capture this by way of a Bayesian update, right? So Bayesian update just tells you, look, I have this kind of structure, I have this kind of uncertainty, and given whatever data you've observed so far, I can easily sort of update my belief in a very, very natural way to account for all the updates, right? To account for all the observations. Whereas these things are typically not possible or even feasible in the frequentist sense, where you want to try and design tight confidence intervals, right? So those might not even be analytically computable. Okay. Right. So I have a lot of time. I'll probably finish early. Yeah.
In the previous slide, you mentioned that the reward is kind of keeping the 3 parameter, either fast or slow, and then lambda. So that gives you constant reward.
That gives you constant reward.
Yeah. So that constant reward somehow connected with this regret, which is like after some time it becomes constant.
No, regret in some sense is. What was the question exactly?
Reward somehow connect to this regret, because after some time this regret is fairly.
Right. So actually both these algorithms, if you give them enough time, right, if you give them a long enough interval of time, they'll actually learn the optimal policy, right? So there's nothing to prevent UCRL from learning the optimal policy in asymptotic sense, right? So maybe I should clarify and say that even though this looks very flat here, so I've drawn actually confidence bars here, right? So there are actually confidence bands here, just to say that this can vary sort of anywhere in this band. So really it's not that this is exactly flat, but it is actually going to have a slight slope, and given an infinite sort of a really large time horizon, both these things will sort of taper off and approach the right optimal reward, okay, in the sense of all these costs that were defined in the MDP. But it's just that there's a dramatic difference in the learning rate, right? So all we want to compare is basically what is the, actually I should be careful, if you normalize the regret by time, then they will actually all go to 0. They'll both go to 0, but it's just that the constant in front of the regret scaling tends to be typically fundamentally different for Thompson sampling, because the regret scaling will intuitively depend on the actual dimension of the parameterization, as opposed to the complete much more larger dimension of the complete parameterization that UCRL uses. Okay. So, so of course, yeah, if you plot unnormalized regret, then this is actually going to grow at a rate, but which is going to be much slower than this. So this will actually, the gap between both of them will diverge. Right? But if you take the per hour regret, of course, it has to both go to 0 because they are both sublinear, right? But they'll go at different rates depending on what dimension of the parameterization is really being exploited. Right? Right. So in fact, this is rather very recent work, and it's not even published, which is why it makes sense to talk about it in a workshop like this. So we actually went and did an analysis. We are actually able to analyze this rather general setting of Thompson sampling applied to a general parameter space and a general specification of likelihood functions on this parameter space. So all you need to basically get Thompson sampling to work is you need a general parameter space, and you need basically for each parameter in that space you need a specification of a complete MDP from that, and then you can basically apply a prior and then you can just update posterior with using this framework, right? And we are able to actually show that if you actually if the designer actually happens to use a suitably nice prior, right, and by suitably nice prior it basically translates to a bunch of technical conditions on the prior distribution on the parameter space, but the bottom line is essentially this, right? So what I mean by a suitably nice prior is, so this is the parameter space. Right, so this is the capital theta parameter space, and you basically have a theta star, which is really the true unknown environment that you want to try and identify in order to achieve optimal regret. You essentially need to start out with a prior that puts enough probability mass in small neighborhoods around theta star. Okay, so it can't happen that, so if you start using a prior that essentially puts, let's say, 0 probability around in a complete neighborhood of theta star, then there is basically no hope, right? You are starting with a belief that doesn't even include your true model, and in that case you can't even hope for things to sort of, you can't even hope for probability to basically concentrate around the true model, right? It will in fact not even concentrate, right? So you at least need a prior distribution that puts some reasonable or non-zero amount of probability mass on increasing balls of theta star, right? And this can be defined in a formal sense, but all you need is that there's enough probability mass in small neighborhoods around theta star. Okay, so that's the least you would reasonably expect to have from a prior in order for Thompson sampling to concentrate the posterior distribution well. And you can show that if you fix a parameter of success that is delta, so if you want good things to happen with, let's say, probability 95%, you fix delta to be 0.05, and you actually get regret in a large time horizon t as something that scales as b plus c log t, right? So the b and c are essentially as follows, right? So b is a quantity, b and c are parameters that of course depend on the problem constants, that is delta, the entire parameter space, the structure of likelihoods, and the prior distribution that you start out with. But what is important is that b doesn't depend on time at all, right? So the scaling with time is really c times log t. The b is just an additive factor that adds to it. The asymptotic scaling is really c log t, where c is a constant that essentially relates in a very tight way to the effective dimension of theta, okay, the parameter space theta, right? It takes a little more digging into so as we stated in the paper, c essentially is the result of a complicated optimization problem that is defined with respect to the parameter space, but it can easily be shown that it essentially follows the effective dimension or in some sense the eluded dimension of the parameter space theta, and in many cases it is likely to be much smaller than the total number of states and actions and state action pairs, right, which is essentially the dimension of the canonical parameterization. Okay. And so this is good news because it essentially shows like nice logarithmic gap dependent bonds, and moreover bonds that actually depend on the structure of the MDP parameterization that you're dealing with, right? So essentially it tells you that if you have a relatively small dimensional MDP, nevertheless with a large number of states and a huge state space and potentially a huge action space, If your uncertainty essentially is in very small number of dimensions compared to that, then you can actually achieve fairly rapid, provably rapid learning, which is a function of the effective dimension, right? And in a logarithmic sense. Okay. And sort of probably take some time to go over the proof sketch and give you very broad, high-level ideas about why Thompson sampling really ends up working. Okay, this in general requires sort of fair amount of technical concentration inequalities in probability and things called self-normalizing concentration inequalities. Right, you might want to look them up, and it might probably be helpful for some of you to know what self-normalizing concentration inequalities are. So if you're interested, just come and talk to me later. Right, so I'll probably spend a little more time. I'll probably be done soon, much before time. Right, so I'll just explain what is the underlying intuition about the success of Thompson sampling. This applies both to the MDP setting as well as the simple, you can think of it even in the simple banded setting. The basic principles that make it work are really the same. Right. Right, so I'll be writing down things in a fairly loose way, but the point is to just convey the intuition. So if you don't really see a very formal sort of notation, just don't bother with that, right? Because I just wanted to get the main takeaway, right? So, okay, so I already have this diagram here, right? So this is the parameter space, right? Let's start with the parameter space, okay? In which the true MDP is sitting at some point, right? And you can think of the parameter space as being partitioned into a bunch of regions, okay? So let me just. So what I mean by each each sort of region, I call each of these regions as decision regions. Okay, so these are essentially related to how Thompson sampling works. Okay, so this is basically all the set of parameters or MDPs having a certain optimal policy or a certain optimal action. Right. So I denote this by S1, S0, S1, S2, S3, S4, and so on. Okay. So Si is basically all the set of parameters or models such that policy I is optimal for the MDP theta. Okay. So I just split this parameter space into different decision regions corresponding to which policy or strategy Thompson sampling will choose if it picks a parameter in that region. Okay, this is basically by just sort of following the definition of Thompson sampling, right? So for instance, you have this theta star, which is a real MDP sitting in some decision region. If Thompson sampling samples any parameter in this entire sort of decision region, it's going to play the same optimal policy. Okay, so it doesn't matter basically what. So even if Thompson sampling samples parameters in the same region as theta star, you're in good shape because you're essentially playing finally the right optimal policy, right? However, if you basically end up sampling from some other region, you'll essentially play some other policy which is essentially optimal. So if you sample a parameter from here, Thompson sampling samples a model from here, it's basically going to play policy number 2 in some sense of labeling, which is going to be optimal for that parameter MDP, but it is not going to be optimal for the true parameter MDP. So hence we'll incur basically regret. Okay. So the main idea here is essentially to analyze the probability distribution over theta over this parameter space capital theta as trying to move probability mass away from all these bad regions and into this region. Okay. So essentially it's about trying to control how much probability can be allowed to stay in all these suboptimal decision regions. Because we don't want too much probability to stay in these other regions because we'll incur regret whenever Thompson sampling samples from them. Okay, is that clear? Right. So this can be sort of cleaned up a little bit, but let's go with the sort of clear assumption that there is only one optimal policy. Right. Of course, so at these boundaries, so there will be parameters at these boundaries for which there will be two optimal policies, right? So there will be several of these decision region boundaries where you will have actually distinct optimal policies, but they will be basically sort of measure zero in this whole space. So the general picture is you'll have these boundaries where you'll have two different optimal policies, in which case you can resolve it by having some arbitrary tie-breaking order. But essentially the bulk of the probability, the parameter space will be taken up by parameters with unique optimal policies. Okay? Right?
So I'm not sure whether it's relevant or not, just to get the geometric intuition clear.
Yes.
So would these regions be connected always?
Would these regions be connected? It depends on essentially, so this is a good question. So it will essentially connectedness or not of this region will depend on the map which takes you from parameters to likelihoods essentially, right? So let's say for instance the queuing MDP, so essentially wherever you have likelihoods or state transition probabilities or rewards that are continuous in the parameter, then I would assume all of these are connected. I think that should give an equivalence between connectedness of these regions and the smoothness property of the map, the parameter map essentially. Right, but yeah, it could be probably even disconnected and so on. Right?
Is that relevant?
It's not relevant as far as we are concerned because we sort of don't care about the. So this might, the geometric structure of theta, the parameter space might really help in the sampling routine. So we are sort of abstracting it away and saying, look, we have access to an efficient sampler. Right? So we don't care as long as we can sample from this space. So this is just an analytical device. So so all this division into compartments is basically an analytical device, and it will not really, geometric properties of that will really not play into stuff. Okay. Right. So this picture, it's good to have this picture in mind, right? Right. And let me write down the posterior update. Okay. Once again, just so that we are clear. Right, and just to illustrate sort of the key ideas in the proof, we'll also assume that, okay, so we'll make a rather strong assumption, which actually need not hold. We'll assume actually that this parameter space is actually finite. Okay. So in fact, even forget thinking about this as a smooth space. Essentially, there are a finite number of candidate MDPs that we're interested in. One of which is the theta star MDP. Okay. Right, and that's all we care about. We start by putting a prior distribution on a finite set of models, and basically Thompson sampling is updating them. Right? Just think of them as think of it as happening in the setting. Right? So of course, if there are larger and larger number of models, this can approximate in some sense a smooth parameter space. But at least for building intuition, it really helps to think about finite parameter spaces. Just to understand sort of what is really going on at work. So the extension to sort of infinite or smooth or continuous priors turns out to be largely technical, but it helps to fix this kind of idea to understand the key ideas. Okay. So the posterior update really is right. So at time t, sampled. Right, so you sampled theta t according to the prior over this parameter space, right? So that is basically the first step of the prescription, right? And then let's say you did something, went ahead with this parameter and then computed the optimal policy to play for this parameter, and then you basically went ahead and played some action, right? So took an action. Let's call that AT, which is dictated by what is optimal with respect to theta t, and then basically you transition to state st plus 1. Okay. Right, with reward rt plus 1. Right. Essentially, this is a single step of the trajectory that you observe. Okay. So and then in the end you ended up updating, so by the rule that I specified, this base rule is just a renormalization. Right, so what will your prior at time t plus 1 look, right? If you factored this observation into your base update, right? So at time t plus 1, right? So your distribution at time t was pi t, right? Let's call this, right? Which you, after you use this data, you update it to pi t plus 1, right? And that happens exactly in this way, right? By definition. So since we are only dealing with a finite set of parameters, I don't need to deal with probability densities, I can just attribute individual probabilities. So in this case, a reasonable prior for the theorem that I described will essentially say that, look, take any prior which puts positive probability mass on theta star, right? That's all we care about, right? So let's assume that there's some prior that you started out with at time 0, which has put some probability, positive probability on theta star, okay? And this is essentially the probability of the posterior probability of a certain model theta, right? So theta is different from theta. Theta is for all theta, okay? For all parameters, we perform this Bayesian update, right? Is essentially proportional to the initial prior that you started out at time t times the probability. So I'll write it as symbolic form as probability under, if the MDP were really theta, right? That you observed a state transition from ST to ST plus 1 given AT, okay? And of course you have to also multiply this by probability that you saw the reward RT plus 1 given AT and ST given AT and ST, right? So this is essentially the Bayesian update, right? You take prior probability, multiply by likelihood of what you saw, and then just renormalize. So the proportionality is just sort of saying that it has to sum to 1 over all theta. That's basically the Bayesian update, right? So let's just, to make matters even much simpler, let's assume that all the rewards, there's no uncertainty in the reward as well, right? So you know the exact reward function. There's only uncertainty in the transition probabilities, right? So essentially, think of the queuing system example that I gave you, where essentially the rewards and costs are exactly known, right? There's only uncertainty in the parameter lambda, okay? Right? So really the Bayesian update is really happening for the transition, using information about the transitions that you see, okay? Right? So if you just think about this, I can write it in a different way here, okay? So let's just exponentiate this just for the purpose of exponentiating, okay? So, right, so the first step is to notice that I can always divide here by a constant, right? So if you have an equation that is holding over every theta in a certain space, which just has to be renormalized, I can always divide this or multiply this by any constant, which doesn't depend on theta, okay? Right? I can just multiply this whole equation by 100 and I'll just kill the same normalization, right? So I just divide this by p theta star, the probability under the true model, okay? The true transition probability likelihoods under the true model of the same thing, okay? Right? I don't change anything by putting a constant here. This quantity doesn't really depend on theta. That's the important point. Okay, you are doing this over every point theta in this space. You are going and doing this renormalization. But this is really a constant from the point of view of every theta. Right? It's a function of what you have seen, the observations, but they really play the role of constants. Okay, is that clear? I don't want to erase this. I can continue this process further and I can write the expression on the right hand side as the prior probability of theta before we started times, I'll just take exponent and log so that it's the same thing. I'll take in fact minus log. Okay. Right, so I'll just represent this, I'll take the exponent and take the log also and then also switch, take the reciprocal. Okay. So it's the same, it's really the same thing. The reason I want to do this will be clear after one step. right? It's really the same thing. I've not changed anything. Now why I want to do this is as follows. Okay, so we basically expressed pi t plus 1 in terms of pi t as a proportionality involving pi t and some quantity here. Okay, so if I just carry this on forward, right? So I should say that because of the proportionality, I also have a denominator that is essentially the sum of all these terms over all theta in the sitting in the denominator. But so if I continue this process, I can essentially write the probability, the posterior distance probability at time theta as proportional to something which involves only the prior. I can go back all the way, I can make t to t minus 1, t minus 2, and I can telescope all the way up to 0. Okay, and essentially what I'll have is pi 0, which is the prior that we started out, right, times, right, so this will just get summed over all t's. Okay. So I'm essentially unrolling the expression for the posterior probability in terms of right all the way up to basically the prior. Okay, and I'm having this sort of rather funny exponentiated term which involves logs of. So this is called the log likelihood ratio. Okay, it's the likelihood ratio of any particular fixed parameter that you want to choose, and basically you want to imagine that your trajectory actually came out as a result of the parameter theta relative to actually the true probability in the actual unknown parameter. Yes.
We are also using a policy, right? So I think you need to marginalize out AT or something like that, because now the right hand side, the left hand side is a function of the policy.
So what will happen is it's not exact. Yeah. So you're right. Not exactly marginalization, but we need to actually account for. The ATs can't be arbitrary ATs, but they are actually ATs that resulted from the policies that you chose. Okay, but however, the update will be the same. So what Thompson sampling cares about at the end of the day to perform this update is just tell me what actions were followed throughout the trajectory. Right? I don't need to know about with what probabilities you took those actions or what probabilities you took those policies. It's just telling me. Look, if you told me that I took action 1 at day 1 and then action 3 at day 2 and action 5 at day 3 and so on, I'll just update basically using the likelihoods for all these actions. That's all I care about.
But then the posterior will be a function of your sequence of actions, right?
Posterior will be a function of the sequence of actions, yes.
Okay, is that okay?
That is implicit.
I thought you didn't want your posterior to be a function of the sequence of actions.
Posterior will be a function of sequence of actions. That is unavoidable.
Okay.
Posterior will actually depend on the sequence of actions, which is why it becomes sort of tricky to sort of analyze this. You can't keep it independent of your sequence of actions, because your sequence of actions will. So it's a classic reinforcement learning thing, right? Your sequence of actions will determine what information you collect, and that information actually will control the posterior that results. So in some sense, the actions that you've chosen actually have influence the posterior that you. So this is ATs will all be sort of functions of previous points of time. But what I am trying to convey here is this really sort of, you can write down sort of a functional expression for the posterior at any given time, and if you basically sort of look at this term, right, so this is really a log likelihood ratio. This is a log likelihood ratio of samples, and if we just make a big leap of faith here, right, so let's say, so this is really something which is illegal to do in probability, but it can be justified using concentration inequalities. Let's try and replace this term by its expectation. Okay, so the randomness here essentially is, so you have fixed, let's say you have fixed some pair state and action here. The randomness here is essentially, let's take expectation over the randomness of the state transitions. Okay, so the randomness in the actual game is really the randomness due to the true MDP. Right, so the MDP theta star is generating the state transitions really, and this is just a quantity that depends on the state transitions st to st plus 1. Right, so in some sense, if you look at this expression, replace it in an expected sense, you basically figure out that the expected value of log likelihood, if you write log likelihood in this way, just becomes something called KL divergence. Right? It's a familiar KL divergence term. Okay, so essentially what I'm trying to say is Let me try and explain it in a different way. Right, so suppose you're let's say, so this is exactly the parallel of the following process. Let's say suppose you are tossing a coin of bias P star, okay, right, and basically what I do is, let's consider some other possible bias P, okay, right, so both P and P star are two numbers between 0 and 1. The actual process is generating zeros and ones according to probability P star, right, and essentially suppose I form the log likelihood ratio, right, so let's toss for a single type, right, and then I note down, let's say outcome is 0 or 1, heads or tails, right. Probability of 1 occurs with probability P star and 0 occurs with probability 1 minus P star, right. So suppose I form the log likelihood ratio, log of the probability that you got the outcome, probability of y given under the true model P star of probability of y under the candidate model P, okay. So this is a random variable, right, so this is a random variable that purely depends on the outcome y, right, okay. You toss a single coin, observe the outcome y and then compute this quantity, right. So if y is equal to 1, this result will be log of P star divided by P, and if y happens to be 0, this random variable's value is basically 1 minus P star, log of 1 minus P star divided by 1 minus P, right. But what happens when you try and analyze the expected value of this, right? So on average, what is this equal to? The expectation is over the only randomness. This were to P star. The true process is P star, right? So what does this become? Is something familiar? It's just the KL divergence. Right? Essentially, working with log likelihood ratios is convenient because on average they are essentially nice sort of distance metrics. I mean, I should not say technically a proper distance, but it's something that is well understood in information theory. Okay? So by the same token, what I'm doing here is that the true process is really the true MDP that is controlling my transitions is according to theta star, but I'm essentially performing updates, posterior updates, which essentially have a term that looks like likelihood ratios. Okay. So basically, if you extend this analogy, what you can rewrite this as is something like, so now the reason for why I took the exponent and log becomes clear, right? It essentially becomes something like, right, and I can actually replace the summation over all time as summation over, okay, so this requires, I'm waving a lot of hands, jumping a lot of steps here, but you can actually sum over all possible policies that can be chosen. The number of times policy C was chosen times the KL divergence under the policy C between the parameters theta star and theta. Okay, so don't really, I guess I'm not going to explain how I got from here to here, but essentially the basic device involved is trying to replace an empirical quantity by its expectation under the true model. Okay, and essentially what you see here is something basic that results out of what the update Thompson sampling is performing, which is essentially, it's in order to get the posterior distribution, it's taking the prior and sort of just multiplying it by e raised to minus KL divergence terms, which essentially are just a function of the geometry of the parameter space, and just trying to add them as many times as you play a particular policy. So if you play a particular policy C, then essentially it will basically take the prior at that time and exponentiate it with a bunch of more terms involving KL divergences. Okay, so that is essentially what is going on. So this is essentially how posterior probabilities are sort of changing in this space. In some sense it looks very similar to this exponential weights algorithm update that Java presented, because it's the same thing that is happening. So in expectation, or with high probability. So these terms are all constant terms. These terms can be well defined. So I guess I have the definition of the next slide. Right? So the KL divergence that results from applying a policy C between parameters theta star and theta can be well defined. Okay, so this is essentially a measure of how much the parameters theta star and theta are separated in the parameter space relative to the policy C. Right? So if you apply the policy C enough times and collect information, this distance essentially tells you by how much the policy C can help you resolve parameter theta star from theta. Okay, so if this distance is high, it immediately tells you that applying the policy C for long enough time steps will essentially reduce the probability, the posterior probability of some arbitrary parameter C, theta, because the KL divergence between theta star and theta relative to C is very high. Okay, so these things can be formally set up. Don't bother to parse these too much. And once you have this sort of much more workable interpretation of the posterior update, at least in an expected sense, it basically reduces to two key properties of Thompson sampling. Right, so the first property essentially is that you can use this kind of structure of the posterior update to essentially show these two following key properties that basically make things work. Okay, so the two model. So what was the true model here, right? The true parameter was theta star, right? Always has posterior probability. Bounded away from 0. Okay, so there exists a P star probability that so there will always be a number P star which is strictly positive, such that at all times with high probability your true parameter actually retains at least that much probability. Okay, this is a key property. So this is just to draw the analogy between comment made by Chapa earlier. Essentially with at least a constant probability, you will be basically doing optimistic things. Right? You will be at least have a chance to sample the true parameter. Okay, and the second property, important property here, right? So this in some sense helps the true parameter survive always. Okay, you can, so this will ensure that the true parameter never sort of gets its posterior probability reduced by too much. Okay, and the second important property that you can show using ideas of this form is basically that right. So here I have written the posterior probability as really being proportional, right? So if I want to really write the posterior probability, I should write this as equal to this quantity divided by some constant, normalizing constant, right? Correct? Right. So assume for the time being that the z is a constant, right? It doesn't really change with time. Let's pretend that z is some constant, just to make matters simple. So what you can say here is that if you are dealing with, let's say, a suboptimal parameter theta, that is to say that theta is, let's say, a parameter which lies in some of the other decision regions, not in the same decision region as theta star, then what you would like to have is this probability of theta really going to 0 first, right? So it should not be sampled too often, right? And the point where that will happen, we can argue it's sufficient that this whole quantity goes down to something which is very small, okay? And you can further carry on the calculation to show that let's say unwanted models theta, right, which lead to suboptimal policies cannot be sampled after the point that, right, so note that this exponent will keep basically growing. This exponent is always the term in this exponentiated sum is always non-negative. It is always going, it's just a number of times that something has been played, some policy, times some non-negative quantities, right? So as and when you keep playing policies, this exponent will basically typically increase for several parameters theta, right? And since this is a minus sign here, the moment when this possible sum hits something like log of t, right? If you take the exponent of minus log of t, it's basically 1 over t, right? And that is enough. So it's enough for probabilities of bad parameters to be driven to something like of the order of 1 over t which equivalently corresponds to saying that we'll wait till the time that this sum becomes equal to exactly log t. Okay. After that, basically you can stop worrying about bad parameters being sampled. Okay. So unwanted models cannot be sampled after this particular sum. Okay, I don't know if you can see this, but I'll write it down nevertheless. So number of times you played a policy times the KL divergence term is approximately log t, okay, of the order of log t, right? And with these two properties, you can essentially go ahead and compute essentially how many mistakes or bad parameters you will essentially sample over the entire course of your process, right? So the only constraints being, you'll stop sampling bad parameters whenever you make this term equal to log t for any particular parameter. Then sampling that particular parameter will stop, okay? So you can just sort of put these two properties together and analyze this whole posterior evolution process for Thompson sampling and come up with a result like that. Okay, so probably was being very loose throughout the exploration, but I guess this gives you a flavor of the ideas involved, right? So very different from standard ideas in UCB and stuff like that, because you have access to actual explicit concentration bounds and confidence sets and so on, which you really don't have any luxuries like that in this much more abstract setting of parameter space with the prior and so on. You really have to deal with the structure of the Bayesian update in its most primitive form. Okay. But nevertheless, you can say interesting things and carry on the analysis. Okay. So I guess with that, I'm basically at the end of this talk. This is just a simple example to sort of show how the C log t, that there's a C parameter in front of the C log t bound works. Essentially, you can carry forward this analysis and build an optimization problem that results from these marginal KL divergence terms dc theta star theta for every C and every theta, and you can frame an optimization problem in path space that basically results into this C parameter, and you can show that it also captures the intrinsic or effective dimensionality of the parameter space. Okay. Right, so this is as far as this study goes. It's really a very preliminary sort of, but nevertheless a very rather satisfying result, because it shows that the Thompson sampling paradigm can really work in much more abstract parameter spaces and settings, much beyond the sort of simple band-aids and other kind of online learning settings. There's really a lot of scope for trying to investigate its performance in much more, let's say, much more more parameterized settings, I would say, but with many more actions. For instance, infinite actions in state spaces. Maybe there's also scope to try and relax this kind of recurrent cycle or epoch structure. This was really artificial in this study that the algorithm that we studied. Maybe it's possible to even try and do this posterior update and sampling every time instant or every few time instants, instead of explicitly waiting for it to return to a start state. Okay? And there are some very preliminary ideas as to how this can be done, but it's a challenging sort of technical exercise. Probably a very important sort of future direction that I would conclude this talk with is trying to see if you can actually combine this with function approximation in a certain sense, right? So when even your state representation requires modeling it with a function approximation, can you actually think of trying to achieve Thompson sampling with approximate representations by maybe perhaps putting a prior on the space of weights of basis functions and so on, right? So can you do something efficient in that sense, right? And it may or may not result in concrete policies. Okay, so thanks.
What was your intuition of that it should return to the start state? Because it looks like, I mean, say, like the example you showed, it would return to the start space and you won't have seen a lot of state space as such. The basic intuition, why that idea?
Right, so the intuition of having it, keeping the policy in place until it returns to the start state is really something sort of, it's more from a technical standpoint. So in a Markov chain, essentially, if you split, if you keep policies constant until you return to the start state, you can actually show that the segments in between sort of visits to that state essentially have an independent structure, just because of the Markov property, right? And that helps us sort of deal with sort of these expectations or conditional expectations much more easily, right? So in the absence of that, it becomes much harder because you have to somehow keep track of the last state which you were in when you sort of took a fresh sample. So there is much more sort of stochastic coupling that one needs to overcome, at least in the proof analysis. But nevertheless, it seems to work pretty well even if you don't impose this artificial return structure. So the simulations actually that I showed that we carried out were in fact when you basically just sample and update every few fixed number of time slots. You don't really wait for the return time. I mean, so it's definitely a point worth thinking about because return times could be really large in general. You don't want to wait so much to sort of incorporate the additional information that you've collected. So this was mainly sort of just for the purpose of being able to say something analytical. But I'm sure that it will produce reasonable results even if you don't do that.
Yeah, so the does the second eigenvalue of the Markov chain which controls the mixing time and all, does it show up in the bound or?
Yeah, so that will actually show up in the bound. It's just that I didn't write it down explicitly. The second eigenvalue actually will show up in the constant, the additive part, not in the multiplicative part. So the multiplicative part really captures the asymptotics of the regret, which in some sense you can actually show interestingly that it doesn't have to depend on the return times. As long as the return times or second eigenvalues are all finite. The intention is really that in an asymptotic sense, if you wait longer or if you have a larger return time, the trade-off is you've actually waited longer and spent more time in sort of bad things that you've done. But on the other hand, you also collected much more information. So that exactly basically balances out the rate at which you get information per unit time. But you're right, definitely the fact that return times can be large will essentially show up in the finite time or the additive part of the bound. Yeah.
There was a p-t tester, right?
Sorry?
P-t, probability of t-tester.
Probability of?
T-tester.
Ah,
Yeah, but you don't know the term, right?
you don't know the?
Term. I mean.
Yeah, the algorithm doesn't know it. But so the nice thing is that right. So I started with writing down the Bayesian update without this term, right?
Okay.
So there, of course, it doesn't know. It just uses terms that it knows, right?
Oh.
But really, you can also sort of just for the purpose of analysis, you can introduce sort of artificial constants. This is just for the purpose of analysis. It is equivalently doing the same thing, right? So this is just a constant with respect to every theta, right? So as I said, you can interpret a sort of Bayesian update as you can scale it by any number, and it will result in the same probabilities. So that is what makes it convenient, the addition of an artificial sort of term that depends on an unknown quantity. But nevertheless, it's performing the same normalization.
Okay. In Thompson sampling, you sample from the posterior, right? So why not take the map estimate and?
Map estimates won't work. So this is probably an exercise for you. So let's go back to bandits, right? Stochastic bandit. You could argue that you could even let's just take the map estimate for the rewards. Right? Why not just take the map estimate, right? So you have let's say a k-armed bandit, let's say a Bernoulli bandit. You start by putting a uniform distribution on each of those and just conduct Thompson sampling, right? At each time you have a posterior distribution, right? So you're saying instead of sampling randomly from each of these arms taking a sample, why not just take the map estimate from each of these, right? So does anyone have an idea why this will not work? This will fail very badly. So okay, so let's say, so here's a much simpler version of the question, right? Suppose you have a coin of unknown bias, right? It's a single arm of a bandit, right? You have a coin of unknown bias, P star, let's say, right? You don't know the bias, so you start by putting uniform distribution, right? And let's say you just take n samples from it. You've taken n samples from it. There are a sequence of zeros and ones that you've gotten according to the coin toss, and you basically build the posterior distribution for it. Okay, what is going to be the map estimate of that? Let's say you have taken n trials and you have seen m number of ones in that. Okay, so what do you think the posterior map estimate will be?
M by n?
It's going to be something very close to m by n. It's not going to be exactly m by n. It is going to be something like m plus 1 divided by n plus 1. You can actually show this.
Okay.
Right? So the posterior distribution is actually going to be a beta distribution. Okay. And then you can find the mean of the beta is essentially the map estimate of the beta. So it's going to be m over n essentially, right? So what happens when you go by choosing the empirical mean in a bandit problem, right? It doesn't work. you need much more exploration in order to sort of reduce regret. You can't just play a bandit by just selecting the best arm according to the best M over N quantity for each. It's a bad thing to do basically. So essentially, sort of, if you just think about it again, the nice part about Thompson sampling is just by virtue of sampling randomly from this so-called posterior or some posterior distribution or some probabilistic object like that, just the fact of sampling gives you this exploration for free. So in a sense, you are actually sampling a quantity whose estimate is essentially the map that you talked about. It's an unbiased estimate of the map or the posterior mean, but you need actually that randomness in order to break sort of bad cycle events.